Josh has joined us from Brightworks, and Josh is a principal over at Brightworks, and he'll tell us a little bit about that. But I wanted to find out first just a little bit more about you, okay? And so your history, how you got here, what you've worked on, and why this is such a passionate event for you.
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here. Yeah, it was really easy. You just took a plane and I got here. No, I think we were asking a deeper question there. And really, as a kid, I loved biology and math. And I went to college and tried to figure out how to combine those two. Found this really interesting program called Biological and Environmental Engineering. And it was fantastic while I was there at Cornell. Also got really involved in an advocacy group, Kyoto Now, really advocating for implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, one of the other previous versions of trying to address these issues. And I graduated with that degree and started looking for work, and it seemed like most of the environmental engineering jobs were cleaning up Superfund sites. And I said, well, that seems like maybe we should be thinking about how not to create Superfund sites in the future. So I do what most people do when they don't know what to do. I went and studied more. So I worked for a while at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and helped with them. They were doing a lot of work, early GHG inventory work for the state of California. They had funding to really understand where emissions were coming from all these different sources. So doing a lot of mathematical modeling and emissions coming out of landfills, emissions coming out of on-road and off-road vehicles, and wanted to start applying that work. So I found a position at Rocky Mountain Institute, the Think and Do tank in Colorado, and did some work there, helping utilities understand what the technical potential of energy efficiency was so that they can invest more meaningfully in reducing energy versus building new power plants. And that was quite fascinating work. And then while I was there, I also built an early version of a tool that tried to look at carbon from a site perspective, from an operational perspective, and from an embodied perspective. And back then that was just a spreadsheet, right? But the industry has come a long way since then. After Rocky Mountain Institute, I joined Brightworks Sustainability. So we were a small consulting firm based out of Portland, Oregon. I was the 9th employee. And originally it was founded to be a corporate sustainability practice. And we were rooted in ISO 14001 and really trying to convince companies to go deep green. And that started to make some progress, but the green building movement is really what took off at that time. So the business really became centered around deep green buildings. So helping everything from condos to universities to offices really think about how to become greener buildings. And the U.S. Green Building Council and LEED and a Living Building Challenge, a lot of these standards came up and people got really excited about them, and has been this fantastic success story of a voluntary mechanism to help people address sustainability where a regulatory framework was lacking. And along the way, I eventually found data centers.
Yeah, and let's dive into that one. So you've worked with some pretty big names. Your company has, and so tell us a little bit about how you tied into digital infrastructure.
Yeah, well, it all started, I think, back when we were doing a couple of really small offices for a tiny little company called Facebook. This is like 2008, so I mean they were pretty tiny back then. I was a bit younger back then too, and I remember walking in there and thinking I was really old because everyone there was wearing Umbros and flip-flops. So we did a couple small office projects for them, and then they decided that they were growing up and they needed to have a data center. They needed to build their first hyperscale data center, and they hired us to help them with that. And I remember the pitch when we went into the eco charrette to kind of evaluate how to be sustainable, how to really push this data center to be very different than what had been done in the past. And the mission that they spoke of at that meeting was, again, it's kind of hard to think about how small that company was back then, but pre-IPO, and they're like, our product is free, and if we don't build very differently, we're going to work our way out of business. We are providing this service, but we have no revenue model. Again, it's kind of funny thinking it wasn't that long ago, but so we have to be the most efficient, the least cost, the everything. And in those first couple of data centers we helped build for them, they broke records, right? PUE below 1.1. We tested ideas like rainwater capture. We went after green building certification and tried to do everything across materials, indoor environmental quality, water, and energy use. And that was kind of my introduction to data centers and learning how different they are. And I think the LEED rating system has always been kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And data centers are a very unique building type, right? The impact is very concentrated in their energy use, and there's quite a bit of energy use in these buildings. And it's been a a journey since then in trying to help data centers become more sustainable, also help lead in some of the other tools out there, also view data centers through the right lens so that there's the right focus and right metrics.
And so you did stuff with Meta now, but you also had worked with other clients, other large hyperscalers, correct?
Yeah, so we've done some work with colos as well. So have done some work with Equinix and Digital Realty, and understanding that they come at it from a different perspective. Other hyperscalers too, like Microsoft, really kind of helping, where the impact is possible. So I mean, with go really deep into, custom servers and higher temperature set points to allow cooling that doesn't actually work in a colo because they have to build for any customer to come in. They have to have a kind of consistent model for whatever customer wants to rent space with them. So where we put our research and effort and how we kind of pitch those savings to U.S. Green Building Council would vary. So we were able to demonstrate a lot of savings in hyperscale and elsewhere in colo, a lot more focus on large-scale renewable deals. That was one of the things we really helped USGBC kind of figure out. Back then, they're really focused on on-site solar, and there's a lot of great things to do with on-site solar, but that doesn't really work very well for data centers. You could paint every square inch of the data center and the site in solar, and maybe you get to 1% of the power. So they've really getting them to think beyond just the building and think about the broader ecosystem of, and now you see a lot of data center companies that are putting in power plant scale renewable projects up the street from where they're building data center campuses, or they're inking deals nationally to create new wind, create new solar. And that's been a really exciting and rewarding development. About 75% of the renewable energy that was built last year about 75% of the energy that was put onto the U.S. grid last year, the new generation, was renewable, and about half of that was driven by corporate buying. Large-scale virtual power purchase agreements, and most of those were, tech company driven. So they've really helped figure out the methods and how to do this, and I think a lot of other industries are now following. So a chance to really lead, to figure out the financial model, to figure out the funding model, to create these kind of interesting mechanisms, RECs and VPAs that kind of allows it to happen and still operate on the grid. And so it's a chance where the data center industry is really led, and I think that there's more chances for us to lead as well as we have new needs and new insights.
So let's talk a little bit more about the lessons learned. Okay, so 2008 you started with Facebook back then. What are some of the key things that you saw from them that we should be considering right now?
Yeah, what's worked really well, I think, is there's a benefit to having some structure and to having some third-party accountability and rigor behind the programs that you build. So we were able to really effectively use the lead rating system as a foundation, and with that you can kind of get a consistent system, a reputable system, something that kind of allows you to better communicate the accomplishments that you've made, since you're getting a USGBC to kind of bless the work that you've done. But we've also learned that it's just a tool, right? It's how you use it. If you use it the wrong way, it's worthless. If you use it the right way, it can be really powerful. And to really build on top of that. So we've done a lot of work with them, in particular, building into their reference design and templates deeper sustainability strategies than even the rating system addresses. So we have now a platform with them where we track throughout construction, water, waste, energy, even from construction impacts. They've set up some dashboards where they can really see how they're operating. We help actually rate their contractors on how well they're performing on a sustainability perspective. Using, again, some of the lead credits as a starting point, but going beyond that to really track some of the things that aren't possible or aren't asked for in the lead framework. Really helping integrate as much as we can into their reference design standards upstream of the project. A lot of data center companies, they build templated designs, right? They figure out this model that works for them and they roll it out. So why don't we pull the sustainability work upstream of the project back to these reference designs, so that then the work on a project level is easier. You're just picking up the regional and the circumstantial opportunities, and you have a lot of the kind of reference design items baked in. So that's been really successful. I think the renewable energy work that they've been doing is really fantastic. I mean, they basically put, within 100 miles of their sites now, they find a spot to put enough renewable energy to 100% feed into their projects. And really the next frontier that we're working on a lot now is the embodied carbon, the embodied carbon footprint. So I think as this industry is trending towards 100% renewable supply, and there's questions around what 100%, right? Is that new renewable, old renewable, wind, solar, hydro? I mean, there's still better, we can do better by delivering higher quality and new renewables more and more. But really understanding once we have 100% renewable supply and the grid gets greener, we really have to focus a lot more on what it takes to build the building and what it takes to refresh the IT over the life cycle of the building, because that equipment is expensive. And at a first blush, cost is a good indication for how much carbon is in something. So if it's an expensive item, it probably took a lot of mining and manufacture and transportation, and by the time it got to the site, it's no longer emitting carbon. But what was that footprint that got you there? And whether that's concrete or a PDU, that a very different kind of supply chain that got it there, and a very different life cycle forward. Concrete, by the time you put it in the building, its carbon story is done. Something like a PDU or something that actually processes or uses energy, it's got a history of carbon, and it's going to also be part of the operational carbon of the project. So really balancing kind of efficiency and embodied to kind of be smart about. And again, like the IT infrastructure, that's going to start to cycle 3 to 5 years or whatever the equipment. So that over the course of a data center's life, we have to be really focused at the equipment too, because that's going to have incremental carbon impacts from an embodied standpoint and operational standpoint throughout the life cycle of the building.
And I think that's a really important point, because when we're looking at holistic carbon accounting, it has to include everything from the creation of the products that are there, the consumption within it, and then the changes that happen over time. And so Joe Cava had talked about this in Santa Clara, and he referenced we have gap accounting today. Gap accounting is about the financial structure and management of these companies. But he said we should look at this as cap accounting. And I had a debate about this last night with a few folks. The cap accounting really comes down to depreciation of something. So in the end of it, I've got a certain unit that I'm measuring, and then I've got a certain time frame that unit is measured over. So for example, the embodied carbon of a building is going to be 30 plus years. So I built that building, I got a starting point. That carbon that is embodied in it is going to be used over the next X amount of years. So, but then you look at it, what you mentioned about with hardware. The equipment going in is every 3 to 5 years. So that means I'm going to have between 5 and 10 refreshes of IT equipment inside of that building over the life of that building. Which means the embodied carbon footprint of that equipment is potentially 10 times larger than what's happening in the building. On top of that, you have the power consumption within that building of that equipment itself. So what is the accounting? Like, where is the carbon? It's a little more complex, but actually it's relatively simple when you think about it from a gap standpoint. We have accounting principles here for a reason, and that allows us all to speak the same language from an economic standpoint. We need to speak the same language from a carbon standpoint, from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. Is that?
Yeah, and this is where I think the industry's been moving really quickly, but we have still a long ways to go. I think, back when I was at Rocky Mountain Institute, it's pretty easy to roughly estimate how much carbon's in a building, right? There's studies that have been done, and you can get metric tons per cubic yard of carbon, or metric tons per an I-beam, and all that kind of helps you roughly budget to get a rough approximation. And that's really helpful when you're just doing your rough math on what's my carbon footprint, how much should I care about operational versus embodied. But we're shifting into a space where, we want to know what the cents are. We want to know what the dimes are. We want to really understand it so that we can make choices that are informed by that data. So it's been a movement over the last decade to have tools that kind of help us actually get into the details, to get more precise, and to get product-specific information. There's a lot of regional differences depending on where certain products are manufactured and what kind of processes and transportation situations are happening to get things from point A to point B, so that the data varies quite a bit region to region. Different places in the world have different construction methods based on availability of resources. So we're really trying to increase the data, increase the tools, and get to a point where there's clear data, there's good data, and when you're choosing between two products that are interchangeable, you can actually make an informed and accurate choice. We're not there yet entirely. I think the a lot of the effort in the green building movement originally was focused on materials that are typical for most buildings. So it's the concrete, it's the steel, it's the carpet, it's the drywall. That stuff goes into data centers too, but there's all this additional IT equipment that is pretty unique to data centers. In a typical commercial office building, maybe they have a rack somewhere, and they certainly have copper wire, but they don't have the level of IT equipment that is in a data center. And there's been less work on that footprint, and increasingly in the last few years, there's more and more, and that's really exciting because we really need to understand those products too, and not just from a carbon perspective too. I think we're trying to, carbon and climate is kind of the calling action right now, but we want to also be thinking broader than that. We want to be thinking about water, because water has an energy footprint. We want to be thinking about social issues, about resource scarcity. A lot of these products too, that they have within them materials that are rare, they're heavy metals, they have complex and dirty supply chains that have not only environmental but social challenges. So I think we want to be solving the climate crisis, but also starting to lay the groundwork and getting data to help us make more informed choices from not just a climate perspective, but a broader perspective of truer kind of full sustainability, not just environmental, but also social.
I can't stress enough how important it is that we have common methodologies to measure. And so you had work with LEED. So really driving, I think, from the U.S. standpoint, U.S. Green Building Council, that type of thing. So what about Europe? So here we are in London. Are there other standards or other things? And again, folks in the audience, if you have that as well, what should we be thinking about, or what should we be working with when it comes down to those different groups?
Yeah, and none of these frameworks are perfect, but I think that they provide a common language and they get you focused on actually having the reduced impacts that you want. So obviously there is BREEAM and there's a number of other programs throughout the world that are more locally sensitive from a green building standpoint. But what the challenge really is the industry is shifting from creating case study green buildings to creating sustainable companies. And that from an ESG and reporting perspective, getting on the path to science-based targets, really having a statement of when that company is going to be net zero carbon, and how that aligns with preventing more than a 1.5 degree increase in our climate. So what we've seen is that more and more companies are making the leap to try and really kind of get on the path to net zero carbon and to be more sustainable in their operations. But the better we can have a clear set of metrics and a clear set of frameworks that kind of guide all companies, the less kind of inefficient work we see. Because what we see, we work a lot with sustainability people for X, Y, and Z company. They hire us to kind of help do the analysis, to help identify the impacts and implement those impacts. But what we find is that a lot of times the sustainability person at X company, they spend so much of their job, basically, they have 20 different customers. They're all asking for the same types of things, but asking them in different units in different ways. So they spend their whole time taking one data set and repurposing it, instead of actually taking that data set and performing it, getting it to a higher level of performance. So while no frameworks or metrics are perfect, the benefit of having a clear set means that if 20 of your customers are all asking for the same information, and you can just print out the same report 20 times, that means the rest of your job you can focus on programs that actually reduce those impacts. So again, using the PUE example, because it's a great one, it just took defining the metric. People debated it for a while, but while they were debating it, they were also improving it. And I'm not sure the debate was ever won or lost, but PUE went down, right? So the metrics are never perfect, but it's a rallying cry. It puts a number on something that really helps people have a common mission. And I think that's what we're really trying to do with the iMasons. The climate challenge is bigger than one person, bigger than one company. It's bigger than one industry, but I think we're in the right industry to have real leadership. The data center industry has, as you mentioned, a very large purchasing power, builds very large buildings, and has a very large footprint, but has a chance to really blaze the trail to create some of the clarity and create some of the methods that will allow other industry types to follow with that kind of clarity around tools and purchasing and creating market demand for products that have lower carbon footprints will make them more commonplace and not the ones that have a premium that other projects can't afford.
The leadership is important. And I think that when we came together in February, it was about how do we unite? And uniting on these common causes. And what you heard was the structure. So the basic structure, we thought if we can simplify this down into these categories that people can understand, that people can actually take and do tangible actions against, we can make the progress we need to. And the urgency there is also the important part. That urgency is around how do we make sure that we're moving as fast as we possibly can because we're running out of time. Plain and simple. So I'm curious from your standpoint, what are some of the biggest things that we can do right now, like short term, from an industry standpoint? What are the decisions and the pieces that could actually make the biggest impact that we can compound going forward?
Yeah, we learned this lesson from, so about a year and a half ago, Salesforce hired us to develop a sustainability rating for their procurement of public cloud. And we developed this great framework, but it was a proprietary framework. So at the end of the project, we went to their procurement team and said, this is what you guys just hired us to put into your procurement system. And they kind of scratched their heads and said, oh, I don't know if we can do this. This seems like a big tent thing. Like, everyone needs to be asking for this information. If it's just us asking for this information, we're kind of stuck with that same problem of being just one of those 20 customers asking for it differently than everyone else is asking. So they kind of gave it back to us. They said, okay, well, we paid you for it, but now it's yours. Where's that big tent going to happen? So I think when you guys reached out to us, it was just a perfect opportunity to set up that big tent. You had these relationships and this infrastructure already, and with the climate board, a clear mission. And I think the biggest opportunity for us really is to pitch that big tent and get aligned and then start moving the market. So I think the ways that you can really act now to do that is, as individuals, I assume everyone in here is already a member of iMasons. That's good. So whoever you're meeting at the conference today that isn't, let's get them involved in iMasons as members individually. The Climate Accord is a company level commitment. And the benefit of joining the Climate Accord is getting aligned and getting the benefit from the clarity and the methods that we'll be sharing, what's working, what's not working. We're going to be setting up a series of working groups to kind of really help address and attack some of the parts of the concept maturity model that Dean presented. So focusing on equipment and materials, power. I think power we understand pretty well. So I think we're going to spend a lot of emphasis on the materials and equipment piece because that's where I think there needs to be better data, more comparable data, and more of a clear kind of ask to manufacturers. So get involved with those working groups. We're also right now producing a series of kind of level setting education sessions. I think we're all pretty clear on what the challenge is. I think what we struggle with when we get into these conversations is that people are kind of interchanging different terms, like what's carbon neutral, what's net zero, so I think we're going to try and put out these level setting educational series. These working groups are open to anyone who wants to be part of them. We're excited to have people sign up. And in the meantime, as we're kind of getting into these working groups, we're really excited to have companies, if you're a manufacturer in the product space, start working and disclosing your products. If you're an operator or developer of data centers, start disclosing your data centers. And what we're going to do at first is just look at all these and start to compare them, not from a who did a better job, but from getting a sense of what are the better methodologies here. And what we're finding is that in many earlier attempts, people use whatever data they had, which wasn't complete. So some projects have gone and done a whole building life cycle assessment of carbon that has included 80% of the building. So we need to kind of call out those gaps so that we can help know where they are and help work on them together. And we're also aware that companies that have gone further often have larger footprints because they've gotten from 80 to 100%. They've tracked down the harder to reach data. So as we kind of work with more companies, we can find what's been missing. We can work with manufacturers to get them to disclose it. And hopefully those disclosures then are put through a similar system so they're actually comparable. You're not apples and oranges, you're apples and apples. And then that's going to be the movement it takes to kind of, and again, you don't manage what you don't measure. I think just by getting that information out there, companies are going to start reducing it. And then as we get to the point where our purchasing decisions can be made partly on what a lower carbon footprint product is, that'll really drive for the further reductions we need.
Great. And I want to emphasize one other thing. RFPs. So last night we had a really deep conversation about this, and it's a lagging indicator of what's happening. Lagging, okay? And the reason is that a lot of the stuff has not trickled down to the RFPs yet. It needs to, but it will. And so I would say get ahead of it. So from the buying standpoint, if you can influence your procurement teams to actually put things in now, you're going to be ahead of the game. If you're a supplier, If you can start to respond to RFPs with the content that you believe they're going to be asking for in the future, you're ahead of the game as well. The point is, we've got to go back to where the forcing function is. It is the buying power, and if we can now align that, we will move things a lot faster. We're uniting the builders in the digital age on multiple things. We're talking about sustainability right now from the climate accord standpoint. We're doing the same thing on education. Same thing with diversity and inclusion. Same thing with technology. So that's the power of this community. All right, well, excellent. I know we got to stay on track. Thank you very much, Josh, for being here.